Welcome to our last session in 24, the last session of our seminar series on cross-cultural approaches to desirable AI. We will continue next year with 3 more sessions in January. So if you're joining for the first time, the seminar series is a collaboration between the universities of Cambridge, Tokyo, Bonn, and the University of Europe for Applied Sciences. I'll quickly link our seminar schedule in the chat. So if you're interested, have a look at the 3 sessions in January, because I think they're going to be very exciting. I'm looking forward to it. My name is Christiane Schäfer. I'm from the University of Bonn and organized the series together with my colleagues José Gösen from the University of Europe, Ai Hisano and Sinjin Oh from Tokyo, and Kerry McInerney and Eleanor Drage from Cambridge. And maybe let me start with a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be recording today's session. You already noticed, I think, except for the discussions at the end. The discussions with all of you will not be recorded. So if you want to make sure that you absolutely don't show up on the recording, then please deactivate your camera for the first half of today's session. The recordings will be uploaded to our YouTube channel afterwards. We'll let you know once they're up and once we've finished with editing them a tiny little bit, but hopefully in January. Throughout the whole session, please feel free to use the chat and to ask questions and discuss. Me and my colleagues will keep an eye on the chat. And if you have any general questions regarding the seminar series, please send an email to the mail address I just posted in the chat. If there's anything after today's session you want to ask us directly and not in this broad forum. Also, since this is the last session of the year, I think it's going to be a very relaxed one. And a couple of weeks ago, we started the session on health and disability studies with a very wonderful access note, I think. And I'd like to steal that for today, just to point out that we all want to make sure that this is an accessible virtual space for all of us. And what that means might be very different to all of you. It might mean that you only use the chat to communicate, or on the contrary, that you unmute yourself and ask your question via video. Both is great. If you need to take breaks or just walk around while listening in, please do so. And I think for the last session of the year, we just all want you to be as comfortable as possible. I'm aiming to end the session at 11:30 German time, so whatever that means for your time zone. But we're relaxed about it, and we'll see what happens and how the discussion goes. Okay, wonderful. Let me maybe briefly introduce our speakers for today in the order they're going to present later on. First up, we have Thomas Metcalf with us. He's an associate professor at Spring Hill College in the United States and a senior researcher here in Bonn at the Institute for Science and Ethics, and also part of the Sustainable AI Lab that, together with our colleague Amy van Weinsberg, research sustainable AI in all its facets and aspects. Tom specializes in social and political topics, as well as philosophy of science and religion. And I think what he also brings to today's discussion is his research and experience in education, especially when it comes to the necessity, but also the difficulties of education on philosophical and political matters. Our second speaker for today is José Renato Laranjeira de Pereira, I hope I pronounced that right, who's also a researcher at the University of Bonn's Sustainable AI Lab and the co-founder of the Brazilian think tank, Laboratory of Public Policy and Internet, shortened Lapin. I'm pronouncing that French because I have to think about the animal, but Lapin, for those of you who want to Google it.
Has some relation with the rabbit.
Perfect, wonderful. José investigates the environmental sustainability of artificial intelligence and its impact in indigenous communities in Brazil. Has been a UNESCO consultant for the 24 Brazilian presidency of G20, especially within the digital economy working group, and focuses on information integrity in AI in that capacity. Lots more to say, but I'll keep it short for now. I think those are the most important aspects of your work for today. And last but certainly not least, we have with us my colleague José Haramia, who's a senior research fellow at the Center for Science and Thought here in Bonn, and part of our Desirable AI team, and also associate professor of philosophy and director of gender studies at Spring Hill College in the United States. Plus a research fellow at the Academy of International Affairs in North Rhine-Westphalia, so lots of different hats. And I think as diverse are your research topics, current research takes place at the intersection of science, technology, and ethics, with a special attention to AI ethics and the ethics of space exploration, especially in all of its environmental aspects. Chelsea is also a member of the UK SETI Research Network and the SETI Post-Detection Hub, and a science advisory board member at the SETI Institute. SETI, for those of you who don't know, stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And in those capacities, Chelsea also works on global planning for post-detection, which will not be our topic for today, but I think we'll all see the connection to questions of environmental and social sustainability when it comes to digital technologies such as AI. Those are our three speakers for this session. Our topic today is sustainable AI in social context. And I think today's topic is so important, and we've already touched on a number of its aspects in our earlier sessions. I think just last week, when we discussed international approaches to AI governance, James Wright from UNESCO started his talk by asking, what is the connection between world heritage and AI? And answered with, this is a transnational technology with transnational consequences. So if we're looking at case studies and details, then the definition of what is just and desirable might be heavily context dependent, but at the same time, we're talking about changes on a global scale. I also think sustainable AI or green AI has been a very omnipresent buzzword in the last 2-3 years, especially in a European context, but not exclusively. Just a week ago, my colleague Chelsea and I were presenting at an industry event where everybody was talking about predictive maintenance in manufacturing, or smart agriculture, and precision farming, or environmental conservation via monitoring, and so on. But what is actually important about sustainability and its many facets gets often lost in the conversation, I feel. And for that reason, I'd really like to start today's session with a very short opening discussion, asking all of our three speakers for today, but also the audience, if you want to pitch in, what sustainability is for you. What is maybe the most important factor, or something that you feel is often overlooked in the discussion?
I'm happy to start, if that's okay. So Christiana, you sent us two questions, and I actually wanted to start with the second one, which is kind of how is sustainability used today, or how has it sort of evolved? And then I'll answer your initial question. But of course, it's a buzzword today. We know this, right? And it's very popular all over in lots of contexts, not just in digital technology contexts. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that as a buzzword, it can get misused or misapplied or just not make much sense, but it still kind of catches people attention. And so you mentioned I do space ethics, and I was at the United Nations World Space Forum 2 weeks ago, and the theme of the forum was sustainability, of course. Sustainability in space for a sustainable Earth, or something along those lines, right? And so you just heard the word over and over again, and it started to become or feel sort of meaningless. But I remember at one point, a speaker was talking about lunar mining and referred to sustainable lunar water, that he wanted to make lunar water sustainable. And so what I want to emphasize is that sustainability has to refer to activities or processes, right? So there's no such thing as like sustainable water, right? It's about activities or process, and those are the kinds of things that are sustainable kind of over time, not just some ostensible thing that you point to. And so for me, sustainability, of course, has its classic components, environmental, economic, and social. And those, I think, it needs to be kept in mind that those things are not always going to be compatible, right? And so these things have to be necessarily ranked. And the rankings can be context dependent, like what should take precedence. But I also want to emphasize that for me, sustainability is actually a pretty low bar, right? Sustainability is kind of a bare minimum. Of course, we fail to reach it all the time, but as a goal, I think it's just the first step, because sustainability is about, very classically meeting the needs of the present while, maintaining the ability of future entities to meet their needs. And that's, necessities are wonderful, and it's very important to focus on those, but I also want to think about flourishing, right? And so how do we flourish now and in the future? And that's more than sustainability. That builds on sustainability. Okay, so I'll stop and turn it over to the other speakers. Thanks.
I can maybe just add something that's similar to what Chelsea just said about my conception of sustainability, because I think it means something we value and we want to last. But for me, I was thinking just kind of what do I think of as sustainability? And part of it is also that it doesn't require a lot of work to maintain it. Like the equilibrium or baseline should be that it lasts and is healthy, right? So like if my bike tire keeps getting flat and I have to keep pumping it up, and I go a block, it gets flat, I pump it up again. I don't consider that sustainable, even though I can keep doing it. I can keep intervening over and over again. But I think that either true sustainability, or at least going beyond the low bar, as Chelsea said, of sustainability, requires that something in its natural state, without human intervention or without too much human intervention or fixing. I think that's sustainability for me. And then related, I was also thinking it implies to me a kind of thriving, or at least maybe true sustainability requires a kind of thriving. So, similarly, if there's some like population of animals in a zoo and there's only like 3 or 4 left or something like that, they're almost extinct, and the zookeepers say, it's okay, we can keep breeding them and they'll last in the zoo, and they will always have 3 or 4 of them at least. That I guess also doesn't feel sustainable to me, even though there's no reason to think it'll end anytime soon, or it doesn't feel, or it feels like there's something like sustainability that we want that's more than just the fact that this will keep going into the future. So those are just a couple of thoughts I had about my own conception of sustainability that I think connect with what Chelsea said too.
Yeah, and if I could add upon that, I think that it's very important that when we think about sustainability, that we think about its relationship to growth and to development, notions that are very strong, especially in policy environments, and also considering that this words became mostly famous through policy environments, especially the UN, and how the notions of growth and of development are problematic per se, because they are entangled in a net of like capitalism and before that colonialism, which is inherently problematic, exploitative, not just of other human beings, but of the forms of life, other forms of and physical spaces as a whole. And if I could already like maybe just briefly start talking about AI, I think that this relates a lot with. I think that when we transpose this discussion to the AI discussion, I think it has evolved in a quite blindsided way, because to some degree it has, even though like we have seen this debate coming even like from the early 2000s, the first decade of our century, so far, the main reflections of these discussions are on energy consumption and on carbon emissions. And then you think about, because of this, you think about, oh, how can we, if we just think about using clean energy, then that would possibly be enough. But you don't think about how clean energy per se is created, is developed, how it is extracted. And so I think that this discussion should be evolved, to encompass the other side of this story, the communities affected, how mining is also entangled in this issue. So I think it's in a something that, and I agree totally with Thomas and Chelsea, that talking about sustainability is just a mere first step, but far, far, far from being enough. But yeah, I think we'll have a lot to discuss about that today.
Definitely. Thank you all. Sounds a little bit now like we should have had this session at the very beginning, but very interesting. José, maybe I can ask one follow-up question to you, but also to everybody else, because you mentioned the policy background and the special importance of sustainability in a sphere of policy making. Could you maybe say a few words on how the discourse surrounding sustainability has changed in the policy world? Is that a new thing, or is that something absolutely not new, totally old, that just gained traction as a buzzword over the last couple of years?
No, I mean, I think that if you look into even the history of COPs, of UNFCCC, like back to the EU 92 conferences, so like we have already some time that this is being discussed. But of course, I think that as climate change becomes more of a buzzword, especially because of how it is increasingly being more evident to everyone. And I mean, when natural catastrophes start being discussed also in the global minority, in Europe, in the United States, I think that this also adds upon like the urgency of this issue in policy spheres. But at the same time, I don't feel like, and I think that this is how the frustrated result of the last COP in Baku was as well. We don't see much of that being translated in active measures. And that's why I think that we need to, in the different spheres in which we work, like here we're going to talk a lot about AI, about digital policy as a whole. We need to embed these measures in each of these of the so-called economic sectors, even though they're all intertwined. But I think that we need to raise the bar in each of them to like maybe detail more this discussion. Don't know if I answered the question, but happy to follow up as well.
Definitely. Thank you. Tom, Chelsea, if you want to pitch in, just say the word. Otherwise, I wanted to comment on one thing really quickly, because Chelsea, what you said at the beginning, I think is very interesting. There is no sustainable lunar water. Makes no sense to talk about sustainable natural resources in a way. But at the same time, talking about AI, I think maybe a very simple thought, but what that highlights for me for digital technologies such as AI is that in that equation, they're the active element that always includes action and the process and human-made decisions in the background. So it's always social and political in a way. And I think maybe, Tom, that is a good segue to your presentation for today. Please interrupt me if anyone wanted to comment on José's point, but I think otherwise, let's continue. And Tom, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So my title is Artificial Intelligence, Political Education, and the Sustainability of Democracy. And I think many of us would sadly feel that democracy is in trouble across the globe in various places. There are authoritarian, anti-democratic governments elected or imposed, and voters commonly choose bad policies, bad leaders. One explanation that a lot of people have talked about is that voters do not generally choose their votes based on facts and evidence, right? And in that sense, we sometimes say that they're irrational, and an important sense of irrationality. So here's an image from, this was around the Obama election times, of a man protesting what he believes to be political irrationality. But the problem is basically, as many people have put it, that voters generally know in some sense that their vote will not change the outcome of the election. It's extremely, extremely rare for an election to be decided by one vote. And so and beyond that, at least in some governments and some jurisdictions, there are further limitations on what a vote can do. So for example, in the United States, there's an electoral college system, which basically means that voters in most states can kind of just assume their vote has almost no chance of affecting who gets elected. And so on that basis, many voters decide their time would be better spent doing something else, right? Their time would be better spent recreationally, or just doing research about something that will affect their life, such as what kind of car to buy or what kind of new computer or phone to buy. So it's an incentive problem, right? Single votes almost never decide elections. Voters don't have a strong incentive to learn about reality, learn about the facts and evidence that affect who should be elected. And so the effect of that is widespread ignorance of politically relevant information and irrational decisions about politics. Irrational in the sense, and this is important, the sense that, again, that they are not based, the decisions are not based on facts and evidence. So we don't need to go through all the little details, but many people have written about this, have studied this. Many high percentages of Americans don't know basic facts about the structure of their government. In some sense, they know less than nothing about some topics, meaning that if you give them a multiple choice quiz with 4 possible answers, they do worse than 25%, right? Meaning they should have just guessed, but somehow they find a way to do even worse. Political ignorance is not, unfortunately, limited to the United States. If you just, a quick kind of search of the literature, there's I found research from the Czech Republic, research from Finland, research from Germany. So one example was that German people surveyed believed that the unemployment rate was 5 times its actual rate, which is, I think, a pretty big difference, right? And again, this is not, this shouldn't be too surprising, right? In most democracies, most voters know, that obviously it varies in the details, but most voters know that their votes are very unlikely to actually affect who gets elected or which policies get passed. And so they, most of them at least, have other incentives for choosing which political beliefs to have. So there's plenty of other literature here we can talk about, but you can look it up yourself. And one of the major problems that this causes, this political irrationality and ignorance, is that the simple problem is we get bad leaders and bad laws, right? That's bad enough. But there's a connection here with environmental protection or environmental sustainability, in that a clean environment or a healthy environment, or reducing climate change, those are what economists call public goods, which for our purposes basically just means, most importantly, it means you can't control who benefits them once they're produced. classic example is a fireworks display. If I put on a fireworks display, I can't really charge people to pay for tickets to watch it in most cases, right? If it's just in, down at the bridge or over the river, anybody who wants to can walk by and look. So for this reason, the standard story, the textbook story is that public goods, it's difficult to produce public goods on the market because it tends not to be profitable, right? A private corporation doesn't really want to produce a public good. There are exceptions, we can talk about those, but basically a private corporation doesn't want to produce a public good because it's not profitable because you can't charge for it, right? And so if environmental protection or environmental, sustainability or stewardship is the same kind of public good, right, which again, it arguably is, right? If I clean up pollution around my city, then that benefits everyone, right? I can't then like charge people money, and if you don't pay the fee, then I dump pollution back in your yard or something, right? I'm not going to do that, right? So a clean environment is the same sort of public good. And if it's hard to produce them on the market, then the textbook alternative is to produce them by a government, right? Basically by coercion. The government says, this is a valuable good for all of us. We can't depend on the private sector to produce it. So, but it would benefit all of us to produce it. So we're going to produce it using our own authority. But of course, if we can't depend on voters to make the right decisions, this is going to be less reliable, right? There's going to be the problem that voters may not understand the value of environmental protection, or they may think they're achieving it in some wrong way, right? And so this political irrationality, as some people have put it, is the problem that prevents us from solving other problems, right? Especially these sorts of public goods problems, such as achieving environmental sustainability, when it's not, most private firms are not motivated to produce it on the market. So what happens if we now, if generative AI is available to almost everyone, at least in rich countries, maybe, in other countries too, almost anyone who wants to can use generative AI to produce text or images or videos. Will this make political knowledge easier or more difficult to obtain? Or will this make voters more or less able to sort fact from fiction? Well, I think it can be the source of a lot of what's sometimes called information disorder, right? So AI can easily be used to produce deep fakes, which are fake, images or video of real people. A lot of things under the general term fake news can produce plausible fake news or propaganda, or even superficially plausible arguments for some conclusion, right? Which, if generative AI is very good at doing that, and so it can be done very cheaply, then it's going to be even harder to find, good arguments or reliable data sources. This, of course, is against the backdrop we already know of psychological biases human beings have, including very prominently confirmation bias, which is the bias that leads us to be more likely to believe things that agree with what we already believe. So if we can all use generative AI to generate news and video and images of things that comport with what we already believe, then it will be very easy to keep us believing false things. So on the social media platform that used to be called Twitter, there was this thing that used to be called a tweet from just a couple months ago, where someone created, I don't know how obvious it is that it's AI. I think to a lot of people in this workshop, if you looked at the image, it would be fairly obvious quickly that it was AI. But in this episode, basically somebody posted this AI generated image. This was intended as a criticism of the Biden administration's handling, I think, of the flooding in Asheville. And so what this person, Parker Molloy, is reporting is, even though it was fairly quickly pointed out that this image was fake, many people commented by saying something like, well, but isn't it in a deeper level, isn't it really real? Or I'm not sure it's fake, or isn't it still telling us something? So even when the image is known to be fake, like it still bears the artifacts of AI generation, people are still, this still gives people an opportunity to believe it, right? Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, said, when we encounter information we don't agree with, we ask ourselves, must I believe it? When we encounter information we do agree with, we say, may I believe it, right? We're inclined to believe it. And so as AI generated images get harder and harder to detect, it seems to me very plausible that we're going to see much more of this, where even if an image is pointed out to be fake, or there's evidence that it's fake, people will still be saying, well, actually, I think that it's really true, or I can't tell whether it's true, right? And so I don't really know how you could think that this will be better for voters making decisions based on real facts and real evidence, right? So maybe there's a solution. Some people have talked about AI for education. If you can use AI to help educate people about politics, political knowledge, maybe then they will be better at sorting fact from fiction. Maybe they'll be more motivated to make good choices by voting. And in fact, there are many good, valuable things about AI augmented or AI-based education. We can talk more about those in the discussion, but it can be very widely distributed across the globe on some platform. Compared to a traditional university education, can be very inexpensive. AI, generative AI tutors can provide personal one-on-one tutoring. They can test the interventions in real time. So what's sometimes called A/B testing. They can give half the students one type of lesson, the other half the other type, immediately test their comprehension, update, right? There's a lot of potentially very good things about AI-based education. And so maybe we can use AI to educate people about politics, right? There's been a few proposals of ways to do this. Most obvious would just be tutoring people in this kind of politically relevant information, right? Giving them a summary of what they need to know. Some people have also said that AI can be used to kind of collect and develop and figure out the preferences voters actually have, because they're not always good at expressing them and then communicating those preferences to legislators. Also, AI can host a forum or moderate a forum for deliberation and participation. Many authors have studied how participating and deliberating make voters into better voters. They make better decisions. So these would be the hope. I think that this, and I'm going to argue that I don't think this is going to work very well, or at least I'm kind of pessimistic. One problem, of course, is sustainability of AI, right? This is something a lot of people in this workshop have already thought a lot about. Now, arguably, and again, we can talk about this, there are kinds of AI-based education that use a lot less energy than traditional education, right? Use a lot less than a traditional university education. And so that's a good point, but we're not in this forum proposing replacing traditional education with AI-based education. We're proposing creating a new source of AI-based education for politics. And so that will, presumably add to electricity use, carbon emissions, and so on. The second, and maybe in some sense bigger or more core problem, is the reason voters don't vote based on facts and evidence is not that they lack access to information. They already they have Wikipedia, which is pretty good. They can go down to their local library. They can go talk to local professors. But the problem is still that voters don't have a strong incentive to obtain the information. There are some details we can talk about, but some of the best types of education, such as active learning, voters don't enjoy that very much. Students don't enjoy that much. It's just hard to see how they're going to be motivated to go through this tutoring. And in fact, if they already make political judgments in a biased way, as some authors have argued, then there's no reason to think that bias will suddenly stop when they start to be tutored or attempt to be tutored in politically relevant information. And similarly with legislators, again, we can talk more about this in the discussion if we want to, but I don't think that legislators are making bad laws because they don't really know what's good for voters or what voters want. And then once again, even if you want to use AI for education to promote deliberation, again, that could be really good, but the question still remains, how do we incentivize voters to actually want to do that? Right. Again, if they still know that their vote is very unlikely to change who gets elected, what can we give them to make them actually want to engage in this process, right? So again, these are reasons for thinking that adding AI-based tutoring in political education is unlikely, at least as I've thought of it so far, to solve the problem. One last thing to mention about using AI-based political tutoring is that I'm not sure that it fully coheres with or respects why we value democracy. So roughly speaking, maybe we value democracy because it's for procedural reasons. It gives us all an opportunity to talk and discuss fairly with each other, treat each other as equals, show our respect for each other, come together and vote. A big alternative is that we only value democracy for instrumental reasons. We think that democratic governments give us good outcomes, right? But I think that in either one of these cases, it's it's questionable whether this kind of educational tutoring is respecting these values of democracy, right? So just briefly, if voters are choosing to consume fake media or not caring whether it's fake media or choosing to make their decisions based on these AI generated fake images and arguments without actually checking them, then that seems like the voters have made a choice, right? If we really think what's important is that voters make choices, then that's happening even when they make their choices on these false bases. And in fact, if we really are saying like a lot of voters are making bad decisions, we need to correct them, that actually undermines some of the procedural justifications for democracy too. But on the other side, if we think democracy just produces good outcomes, that's why we have democracy. That's the instrumental side. I think you can argue that so far it's been producing some, in many cases, some bad outcomes. As AI gets more widely used, it'll be worse. And so we should be thinking about very different alternatives. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is sustainability, because I think someone might wonder, what are we talking about when we talk about this? What are we talking about when we talk about sustainability? What's the connection here? And one of them kind of straightforwardly is, as we started this session, I said, what is sustainability to me? It seems like something you value, that you want to last, and that you don't want to have to keep intervening in. You want it to function by itself in a kind of equilibrium. And so, of course, I think we can ask about this like societal sustainability or the sustainability of democracy or liberal democracy, right? And again, as I've suggested, widespread access to generative AI will threaten the sustainability of democracy or good democracy. And I think that AI is unlikely to be usable as a cure. As I mentioned earlier, right, you can conceive of political irrationality and ignorance as the problem that prevents us from solving other problems. And so remember, I said that environmental protection or ecological sustainability is arguably a public good. It's something that is very difficult for private individuals or corporations to be motivated to produce. So we may need to produce it as a government. But as I've been suggesting, that's going to be less and less reliable as voters' choices get worse and worse. Here's a quick example. It may be contentious, but if you compare per capita carbon emissions in France and Germany, and you compare nuclear power use in France and Germany, right, there are major differences there. This is obviously some debate, bits and pieces of this are debatable, but, hypothetically, if voters are afraid of nuclear energy, even though most experts think it's a good alternative to fossil fuels, and the voters ban nuclear energy irrationally, then you get more carbon emissions. Right. So it's sustainability of democracy has a lot to do with environmental or ecological sustainability. And of course, just in general, why do we care about sustainability? It's, we want a good world for the future for ourselves and our descendants. That's a major reason. It's not the only reason, but a major reason. And so I think that if we value liberal democracy, and I think it's pretty good form of government, probably the best form of government, then I think that's a good reason to care about sustainability too. So real quick, is there an alternative? I don't know. Some people have proposed either weakening democratic authority or decentralizing it. Those are obviously have their own problems, but they may help to limit the damage that an electorate that is further persuaded by AI is going to end up doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Are there any immediate questions, clarifications, things you don't want to forget and ask Tom right away? Please do so, either write in the chat or just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Big questions. I mean, of course, I want to ask right away if we have to think about very different alternatives, then what are those? But maybe we'll continue with those questions later on. Especially after your last slide and your conclusion slide, I'd be really interested if there's anyone from Switzerland in the room, someone from another country with direct democratic structures, and you want to participate and tell us about your experience in that regard. Would be really interesting. Case studies from those countries could be interesting here. If there are no immediate questions at the moment, I think let's keep in mind what we want to discuss afterwards, and I'll hand it over to José and AI policies and the environment.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. Congrats, Tom, for the great talk. Please let me know if you can see my slides now, maybe. No, I don't think so, right? Gosh, I did it so
Loading?
well the last. Wait, I
Maybe
did it
try
so
again.
well the last time. Yeah.
It's loading. Maybe it just takes us. Yes, now. Perfect.
Okay, great. You're seeing a presentation, right? Okay, great. Well, once again, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about this relationship between AI and environmental impacts, or AI for dealing with environmental degradation, but from a policy perspective. As Christian already mentioned, my name is José Renato. I am a researcher at the University of Bonn Sustainable AI Lab, and originally from Brazil. But yeah, I usually like to start talking about this theme, reminding about how throughout time the digital industry did a really good effort in making whatever it was producing as abstract as possible. So when we think about AI, we think about these, and we Googled it. Here I Googled it in Portuguese, but the same would go with in English, for instance, and I don't know, any other language that at least I have some notion of. You're gonna see like these beautiful semiconductors, these hands like here holding with such a mighty power these invisible things. But actually, and I think especially in the last, I would say, 1 or 2 years, we have been having in the media a bit more widely shared what are the environmental costs of these technologies, and how the debates, especially the geopolitical struggles around infrastructure relate to the interests of global powers, but countries, national states as a whole, with regards to these technologies. And I think that the main, as I mentioned briefly after the first question posed by Christian, I think that usually the first thing that comes to our mind is how much ChatGPT consumes energy. That, well, if you generate one image, let's say with Stable Diffusion, it will cost like the same as charging your phone. So imagine this like millions of times per hour as the whole world starts using these technologies. And because of this, like many different groups, like UN agencies, consultancies, in this case banks, have started to try to map the demand of energy of these technologies. And here is an analysis by Goldman Sachs, big corporation from the US, talking about the surge in the demand of energy by data centers, which are the power, like say, the physical infrastructures where data processing occurs, including for training AI systems, how it has been growing throughout the last 8 or 9 years. And here you see that the surge has been very, let's say, significant. And the estimates are that this continues growing. Of course, this is, many people contest this. Some say that with the advancement of technology, the efficiency of these systems will improve, and then we're going to have a lowering of these expectations. But so far, this is what many people are arguing, and here I include also the International Energy Agency, body of the United Nations, has recently published. Even if we have a really strong technological advancement in this sense, the surge demand of these technologies and how they are gathering more and more investment shows that until 2030, it's very probable that we're going to have double the size of energy consumption as we had in 2022. And there's also and so this has been driving for a strong race after clean energy to produce these systems, especially because many big tech companies who are leading the development of these technologies are started to recognize that they're not going to reach the climate neutrality goals, so they call, in the period that they were aiming for. And one very specific case and alarming was Google, when it announced that its emissions climbed nearly 50% in 5 years due to AI energy demand. But well, it's not just about energy. It also relates a lot about water. And I think that the Chilean case was very interesting in this matter, because it was, for me, a really good example of social community-based resistance against the installation of data centers, especially by big corporations. When a project by Google that would consume, if I'm not mistaken, it would be like around 30 million liters of water per day in a region that has been suffering from severe droughts in the last 10 years or so. And then after a huge movement from civil society organizations to raise awareness among the communities that will be impacted by the installation of this data center, they managed to take this case to court after much secrecy posed by both Google and the Chilean state, but they managed to block the building of these data centers there before it really started to occur in their city, which was very close to Santiago. But it's not just about water. It's also about minerals, and this here is very representative of, for instance, how this impacts indigenous territories in Brazil. This is a picture of a territory of an indigenous territory in the Amazon.
I can't see the screen.
I think.
I don't.
What? Sorry.
I just wanted to flag that I can't see your screen.
I can.
It's visible for me as well.
Maybe you should click on the top of your Zoom. I think there could be like a.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Sorry,
you're welcome.
thank you.
No worries, you're welcome. Where was I? Okay, this is a picture of an indigenous territory, more specifically the Yanomami indigenous territory, which is a very wide area in the Amazon, which is protected. And specifically in this region, there is a huge concentration of gold and cassiterite. And what has been going on, let's say in the last, I would say since the first white man came to this land, which was in the 50s or so, like where increased presence of white people took place. And they started like finding about these minerals there. Then these communities have been suffering a lot. But especially in the last 2 years, there has been a surge, also because of how the last government, Bolsonaro, weakened environmental protection in the country. loads and loads of gold miners have been invading the territory, bringing violence, epidemics, and it has been found that a part of this gold was being sold to companies like Amazon, Meta, and Google to build their own products. And here is a news piece in Portuguese in Brazil saying that the federal police is aiming to understand how big techs are involved in the sold of cassiterite from Yanomami territory. And well, this is not just in Brazil. This is a picture from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where lithium is mostly being extracted through the industries, battery industries for electric vehicles, cell phones, and so on and so forth, without much being left of benefits for local communities. And finally, e-waste is also a huge issue. I think Ghana is a really strong example. It receives like most of electronic waste coming from Europe. And within this debate, especially in the last few years, Emil van Weinsberger, but also other authors, here is a reference of a paper that my colleague and also Tom's, Sophia Falk, wrote with Amy on this discussion between AI for sustainability and sustainability of AI, which despite all of these impacts, we have been also witnessing a huge increase on discussions of how AI could help protect the environment. And so they bring this differentiation between what AI for sustainability is, which is basically designing systems to tackle climate change or other environmental degradation as a whole, and the sustainability of AI, which is working on how to on understanding the impacts of the industry, how to solve them, or maybe understand this technology as a whole as something per se unsustainable. And because of these issues, many, as I mentioned, many policy instruments have been tackling them. And I think that both AI strategies, which are, let's say, proposals made by governments establishing plans for how investment in AI, like AI development as a whole within the territory, should take place. And I will bring some comparative analysis on how Brazil does this, but also countries in Europe and China. And in Brazil, first of all, there was an initial national AI strategy that was published in 2020, but it didn't say anything about sustainability. And then earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken, it was in April or so, there was published the Brazilian Plan on AI. And it talks about the necessity that data centers are sustainable, that they be as efficient as possible, and that they use clean energy. And at the same time, there are many discussions on a data center policy for Brazil. And much has been said about, much is being said actually in the country, and the government specifically is sponsoring a lot. The fact that since Brazil's energy sources are mostly from clean sources, Brazil could become a sustainable powerhouse for data centers. I'm going to discuss like the implications of this afterwards. Here in Europe, France in 2022 talked in its strategy about increasing the energy efficiency of AI systems, but also, on the other hand, on AI for the energy transition. Germany, on the other hand, incentivizes systems that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, calls to improve environmental regulations for promoting sustainable AI systems, and it has recently adopted the Energy Efficiency Directive that was debated at the European level, and it has been advancing a lot on instances such as standards and measurements for measuring what is, as the name says, measuring what is the energy impact of these infrastructures. China also has been talking about a little bit about this theme, but on the sense that it incentivizes systems for intelligent environmental protection, which include intelligence prevention and control systems for environmental protection and sudden environmental events, mostly climate catastrophes. Finally, South Africa is working on a document now on an AI strategy, a discussion document, as they say, which says integrating which aims to, among other issues, integrate data and AI into energy to increase capacity, enhance efficiency, and develop adjacent industries. And at this point, I think that it's very interesting to note that most of these strategies are focusing either on AI for sustainability, in the sense that AI could be a solution to climate degradation, but also on, but when they talk about the impacts of AI, they're mostly focused on energy costs. I think it's very important that we keep that in mind. So far, does anyone have questions? Please feel free to do so. I don't know if I'm going too slow and whether I'm taking too much time. Please let me know if it's the case. Okay. So I think no one raised their hands. Let's keep going. I'm not going to talk about regulations, and I will mostly talk about like how are the discussions now in Brazil happening with regard to the AI bill that was just approved in the Senate, but which is now going to the lower house, which is the Chamber of Deputies, to be discussed. So not yet fully approved, but at least it passed one house. And when we talk about environmental issues specifically, and it's mostly principles based. This is not the case of the legislation as a whole. It has specific rights and rules for AI providers and deployers. But when it discusses environmental issues, it is mostly through principles that you should aim. The provider should aim that to reduce the maximum that one can the energy costs of the system, the water consumption, and etc. But there is no specific rule on how should that be, establishing standards and so on. Of course, there are mentions about potential voluntary codes of practice, but we all know that this is not effective enough, as we have been seeing throughout the years on how companies have been complying with legislation throughout the world. And there are also, on the other hand, a few incentives for companies to be more sustainable, especially when they talk about, when the bill talks about government funding of SMEs that are developing or deploying AI. So like it is one of the criteria to be followed for a governmental decision to fund an initiative or not is how sustainable it is. And finally, and this very similarly to how the UAI Act provides, providers of general purpose AI, which include generative AI, should prove that they have adopted measures to reduce resource consumption and enhance efficiency. And I think that when we look into the use case, what is most interesting, and I forgot to include a reference here, but I wrote an opinion article for the Heinrich Böll Stiftung talking about this, the evolution of the theme of environmental impacts of AI throughout the different drafts of the AI Act. And I think that we could separate this analysis in three different stages. On the first one, which was the Commission's first draft of the AI Act, it delegated the reduction of AI's environmental impacts strictly to voluntary codes of conduct. In the European Parliament, this theme became much more robust, and in their adopted version, they established that high-risk AI systems should have logging capabilities to measure or calculate resource use. Providers should assess the environmental impacts of their systems throughout their life cycles. And providers of foundation models should adhere to standards for reducing energy and resource use and enabling measurement and logging of their environmental impact. And unfortunately, most was watered down during the so-called EU trilogues. And mostly like what it establishes is that the Commission should request standards for reducing the consumption of energy and other resource consumption of high-risk AI systems and GPAI during their life cycles. And well, this brings me to ask what next? What should we aim for when talking about tackling the environmental impacts of AI systems through policy, either through strategies or through regulation? And first of all, I think that information disclosure is essential. Environmental impact assessments are one way of doing that before you start using the system, and as well periodically after you put into the market through logging. You bring in information on how much it could impact the environment, how much it is impacting the environment. And I think that very recently, a colleague of ours from the CST, actually, Nicolas Klug, he developed this LLM in Portuguese, the first super open source system, remembering that Facebook's Meta's Llama is not truly open source because it's not open data, not open code, but in his case, he did it. And also together with two colleagues and Sophia Falk from our institute, they also did an environmental impact assessment of it, saying how much energy the training of the system might have consumed, an estimate, of course, and how much water it could also have consumed. So this kind of issues are very fundamental. The establishment of thresholds for source consumption is also key. And I think that international cooperation to combat environmental damages, especially punishing of bad actors, is fundamental because it is all based on a global trade market, which comes, as I mentioned, from extracting minerals from the ground until selling as a final product an iPhone or so. And finally, I think that participation of affected communities is fundamental. And here I just included a picture of Chimeia Vaité, who is an indigenous cacique in Brazil, a leader, the only one to participate in the 3 years of discussions on the AI debate in Brazil. Gosh, I just realized that I'm taking too long, so I'm gonna very quickly go through the next slides. But yeah, for strategies, I think it's fundamental that we think about resource consumption, but as well that we think about the environmental impacts when we think about green energy. Here's a picture of a wind energy field in Brazil, which has been impacting a lot of local communities, especially fishing communities, quilombola communities, and so on. And this man here, this gentleman was called, unfortunately he passed away, Nego Bispo, great intellectual in Brazil, a quilombola as well. And he talked a lot about these impacts in his communities and how we should reframe the way that we look for development and that and how colonialism still takes place today. And finally, I can be very quick on this. This is a picture of an indigenous territory that was completely flooded for building in a hydroelectrical power plant in Brazil. This is the people Gaviões da Montanha, and they had all of their sacred sites destroyed because of this project. And of course, strategies should also include international cooperation to combat these damages. And most of all, and I think this relates a lot to the title of this series, focus on the desirable systems for the communities. In this case, this was a conference that was held in Berlin with Yaualapichi, indigenous peoples in Brazil. And they talked a lot, for instance, of how drones could help them patrol their territories and so on and so forth. So maybe we should be looking to how these communities think that technology would benefit them instead of just thinking about advancing LLMs at all cost. And well, that's it. Sorry for taking so long, truly, but obrigado, and I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards. And sorry once again.
Sorry, still muted. No worries, José. I think we have the time, and that was very interesting. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a lot of questions, especially about the last couple of examples that kind of gave hope after 2 talks that very much made problematic the possibility of participation and true information, but I think we'll talk about that later. Any immediate questions? As with the next talk, please just type your questions in the chat if you don't want to raise your hand later on. I think we can already start collecting questions for the final discussion at the end. But in the meantime, I'll hand over to Chelsea and unsustainable AI and global ethical inequality. Another optimistic talk, I assume.
Thank you, Christiana, and thank you, Tom and Jose, for your excellent talks. Really happy to hear everything you had to say, Jose. So no worries about the length. And I was happy that you were going before me because again, I thought that you would outline some of the environmental issues that I wanted to reference. And so we'll see how depressing this is. I think it'll be okay. So my talk is titled Unsustainable AI and Global Ethical Inequality. And I'm going to start just with a quote here from Benedetta Bravini from her 2021 book, Is AI Good for the Planet? Where she says over 19% of the world's total population owned a smart device in 2019. And this figure is expected to increase by 37% by 2021. We are now in 2024, approaching 2025 very rapidly. And surely the figure is continuing to increase as we proceed. But one of the things that stood out to me when I first read this is that 19%, and of course this is an old statistic, it's a really a minority, right? This is a, globally speaking, that's certainly not most people, right? And so Benedetta talks about AI in a specific way. And so I want to use her characterization of AI here, because there are, of course, many ways to reference it or to characterize it. And hers highlights the ways that it connects with sustainability and unsustainability, of course. And so she says, one can understand AI as a set of technologies, machines, and infrastructures that demand amounts of energy in order to compute, analyze, and categorize. They use scarce resources in their production, consumption, and disposal, exacerbating the problems of waste and pollution. We saw examples of that from José's talk a moment ago. And then, of course, this leads to environmental injustice. She says resources to build AI are taken from developing countries that don't have any of the necessary infrastructure, data centers, research centers, or other means to participate fully in or monitor the precipitous competition for AI. Furthermore, as her book has shown, very often the same developing countries bear the environmental costs of AI, from the mining of resources necessary to build AI devices to their disposal, thus deepening the inequalities of colonialist capitalism. Now, a classic definition of environmental justice is when everyone has equal access to the decision-making procedures that affect their lives when it comes to treatment of the environment. And so as you can see, oftentimes there are places that are being affected, often very harmfully affected by these activities, but aren't also at the same time given the means to participate in the decision-making procedures that lead to these effects. So this is a very clearly kind of cut and dried case of environmental injustice. Now, so this leads to, I think, a perhaps familiar problem, especially for a lot of people who are attending or presenting in this series, in this panel series. And so, of course, the use of AI and smart technologies is on the rise. That's from the first quote. It's unsustainable, right? And so this is, of course, in a very environmental sense, but also in the sense of social unsustainability, right? Because it's not only leading to environmental harm, but environmental injustice in such that the benefits of use of AI and smart technologies disproportionately fall on the minority, and the harms are disproportionately felt by those in the majority world. And so a minority of humanity are benefiting while creating AI-driven global problems of environmental harm and justice. So when you have global problems, at first glance, you might think, well, it's everybody's responsibility to deal with something that affects everybody, or at least it's a shared responsibility issue. However, of course, those responsible for causing the problems are very, very responsible in an important sense, and probably more so. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this is a less familiar problem. So the minority who are creating AI-driven global environmental problems are doing more than just this, and this is bad, right? I'm not wanting to diminish the wrongness or the badness of this kind of environmental injustice and environmental harm, but they're also creating the conditions for morally permissible environmental degradation and morally impermissible ethical inequality. And so what do I mean by that? So this is very similar to a very familiar problem, and actually, quite tied up with it. And so this is the kind of thing that global justice, global ethics theorists have been discussing for a long time with reference to the Industrial Revolution, right? And so before AI or digital technologies were all that common, we still had this kind of phenomenon, right? Where you have these highly hyper-developed nations outsourcing a lot of their procedures, a lot of their, manufacturing, a lot of their labor to other parts of the world. And then all of these economic benefits kind of stayed with the highly developed countries. And a lot of the environmental harms disproportionately fell on the areas of the world where they were being, they're exploiting the land and the people and the resources. And so this is, this is a reflection of what we're seeing with AI. It's just a continuation of this kind of dynamic. And so Henry Shue from 1999 wrote, "The citizens of poor states certainly have no general obligation, which holds prior to and independently of any agreement, to assist the wealthy states in dealing with the environmental problems that wealthy states' own industrial processes are producing. It may ultimately be in the interest of the poor states to see, say, ozone depletion or global warming stopped, but in the medium term, the citizens of the poor states have far more urgent and serious problems." And so this idea that, okay, we have these global problems, they're not restricted, and they, of course, these days are increasingly affecting the developed nations in harmful ways. But Shue gives the example of, let's say you realize your roof has a leak. And so you ask your neighbor, "Hi, can you help me fix my roof leak?" Meanwhile, their house is on fire, right? That would be ridiculous. If their house is on fire, they have obviously much more immediate and present concerns to deal with. They have no obligation to help you with your leaky roof. But this is what he sees as an issue when it comes to the radical inequalities that we see in the world today. And because the people in poor parts of the world and the majority world are oftentimes, not across the board, but oftentimes so much more focused on things like survival and meeting a basic threshold of things like, human welfare and dignity, then they're warranted in spending their time and attention and energy on the immediate problems in front of them, and aren't obligated to help those in the minority world, in developed nations, clean up the messes that they, of course, caused. So if the wealthy states are content to allow radical inequalities to persist and worsen, it's difficult to see why poor states should divert their attention from their own worst problems in order to help out with the problems that for them are far less immediate and deadly. And so what he's getting at here is that with these radical inequalities, which he defines as when there is a resource situation, when there's enough for everyone, kind of globally speaking, there's enough resources, but some have more than enough, sometimes much, much more, and some have less than enough, sometimes much, much less. This is a situation of radical inequality. And he says, in this kind of situation, if you're going to engage in the kind of maybe polluting activities or environmentally harmful activities that allow you to kind of improve your situation in really necessity-based ways, in really important ways, then you're permitted to do that in ways that those in wealthy parts of the world, in the minority world, aren't permitted, right? The kind of the environmental harms and pollution that they engage in, that's impermissible. And so we have this kind of two-step ethical judgment here, where if you're in the minority world, you're in a super wealthy developed country, and you are doing environmentally harmful actions, you can be rightly judged for that, and you can be deemed to be doing something morally impermissible. Whereas if you're doing also environmentally harmful or polluting things, but you're facing situations of radical inequality, and you're not getting your basic needs met, then you're permitted to engage in those same kinds of activities. And so when it comes to things like AI use, smart technology use, this means that these activities, which we know are harmful to the environment, and José showed us, not just carbon emissions, the water use, the cooling, the mining, the e-waste, there's a lot of harm that you're contributing to if you're using smart technologies. But the moral responsibility to solve the problems of these unsustainable technologies falls on the shoulders of those in the minority world that are causing the problems and disproportionately harming those in the minority world. And so the idea is that in order to correctly address these unsustainability issues, the fact that the current technology, smart technology use is unsustainable, we also need to address the issues of radical inequality, because otherwise there is no kind of blame to be placed on those in the majority world who are contributing to this environmental harm, but through smart technology use, but doing so under conditions of radical inequality. Okay, so that's just kind of a basic little argument about why it might be morally permissible to engage in environmental degradation if you're suffering from conditions of radical inequality. And one, I'm going to go through a couple of objections to get to my kind of highlighted conclusion. So I think an obvious objection that I want to address right away is that this sounds like catching up development, right? So just give those in the majority world enough resources that they can start acting like people in super wealthy industrialized nations. But these are very unsustainable lifestyles that people in the minority world live. And so if we want everybody to globally start living those lifestyles, we know that's really bad for the environment and of course for future generations. And that's clearly then this kind of inherently unsustainable activity. And so my response is that I'm not suggesting that members of the majority world positively ought to engage in the kinds of activities that are so potentially harmful or contributing to this environmental degradation, but that they're exempt from moral blame if they do so, right? And so that's distinct from saying they ought to be brought up to the level of lifestyle of, people in the global north or something like that. And so if unchecked growth is bad, then the moral focus must be on those who disproportionately benefit from that growth and not on those who disproportionately suffer from it. But it still says that there is a group of humans that are exempt from moral blame for doing the exact same kinds of things that another group of humans are liable for the moral blame, that there's legitimate moral blame there. And so this leads to a second objection, which is that granting the poor a moral pass can render them morally second class. And this is something I've seen in veganism debates where going vegan can actually be really expensive. And so maybe you get a pass if you're poor. And the idea here is there's theorists who critique this as saying, this is saying that if you're poor, then you're just in this lower class of moral agency. And that's, that's kind of offensive. And so this could reinforce the colonialist mindset that certain groups are morally subpar. That's not desirable. It could even potentially lead to the internalization of feelings of guilt and inferiority among group members, or feelings of presumed superiority by those with the colonialist mindset. And so we don't really want to be reinforcing maybe an ethical hierarchy here, where if you're a rich and wealthy member of a certain nation, then you're kind of in an ethically higher class than those who are struggling for survival. And so taking this objection to heart, I think that this, rather than being an objection to the worry about morally permissible environmental degradation, it highlights just a kind of further problem with these unsustainable activities. And so because these activities of unsustainable technology use don't evenly affect everyone globally, right? There's global effects, but they're disproportionately harmful in poor areas and disproportionately beneficial in wealthy areas. This situation is a result of radical inequalities. And so I want to highlight that in order to address the remedying of radical inequalities, when we're talking about just resource distribution, for example, one of the perks of, or the clear benefits of addressing radical inequalities when it comes to resource distribution is that it also at the same time allows us to address this ethical inequality, this problem at hand where it is a different set of expectations, kind of in an ethical or moral sense, for people who are faced with really, really immediate problems, and don't have the kind of luxury of the resources that enable you to engage in what I call, ethical reflection. So I contend that ethical inequality is a part of radical inequality when it comes to resources. And because radical inequality severely restricts your available choices, it severely restricts your ethical deliberations. And so this means that you are not, kind of positioned in the same way as a moral agent as others. And I think that's unfair, and I think that's unjust. And that's part of what we should be focusing on providing the conditions for when we're doing this kind of remedying of radical inequality, and assigning responsibility for addressing unsustainable activities. So engaging in ethical reflection and ethical activities should not be a luxury, and ensuring that groups, including and especially groups in poor areas, are in a position to engage in expansive ethical reflection and action is an important part of remedying radical inequality. So just my quick conclusion is that unsustainable AI, which is just AI and digital technologies, it's as it's currently practiced, is unsustainable. But this doesn't only exacerbate the radical inequalities and environmental injustices that we've seen referenced. They also uphold the dynamics that create and or perpetuate conditions of ethical inequality. And I think that providing conditions for ethical inequality now and then maintaining those into the future is an important facet of what I'll call ethical sustainability. Thank you.